Hello and welcome to Euromonitor's podcast series. My name is Jessica and I am the multimedia producer here at Euromonitor. And I am joined today by Nadejda Popova, who is a project manager in the travel industries. And today we are going to be talking about the impact of inflation on airlines. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Jessica. Pleasure.
All right. So my personal background, I'm going to be fully transparent here, is that I have these vouchers for a flight that I need to spend, and I cannot find a flight that is as cheap as the flights that I got when I originally bought the vouchers. So I am excited to talk to you today because there's something going on, and I just kind of want to chat with you and see what your insights are.
You know, Jessica, I think pretty much every one of us would have the same question because we all love to travel, right?
Yeah.
And because airline industry has been so, accessible, and the prices of the travel tickets have been so low for such a long time. And I talk about before obviously the crisis, the COVID crisis hit. That of course, now that we have this revenge travel in our heads and we're keen to travel and experience different cultures and different places, this is the number one question. So yes, definitely, I'm very happy to kind of walk you through what is happening in the industry, and what we're expecting going forward.
Yeah, so you kind of touched on it there, but can you start us off by telling us where the airline industry is right now?
You know what? It is a very much a mixed bag, I would say, because, you know, as we were kind of coming out of COVID 19 and the pandemic, we expected that the recovery will begin in 2021. But then we've seen these new variants of COVID 19 and the new travel restrictions that have prevented the sector from recovering much faster. And when we talk about these travel restrictions, think about, for instance, Asia Pacific, that have been hit by, staying at home requirements for much longer than, for example, in Europe. As a result of that, the projections were that 2022 will be a year of much slower but continued recovery. And at the beginning of this year, we've seen the unfortunate events and the war in Ukraine, geopolitical uncertainties, high oil prices, the increase and skyrocketing inflation. And all this is, of course, impacting the consumer demand and potentially could put a dent in the forecast for this year. But when we talk about overall performance of the industry, we also need to think about, supply chain challenges, increasing labor costs, and then also the price of flying more sustainably that are going to have that additional impact on the segment. Because the more we talk about sustainability, the more the consumers are demanding from the airlines to adopt practices that are sustainable, and that are more immediate rather than just staying in the annual report as a goal, as a strategy for these players. Now, at Euromonitor International, we're using and seeing using data from the United Nations World Tourism Organization, and our projections are that there would be 70% increase for international arrivals for 2022 in terms of number of trips. But of course, we have to kind of identify here that this is growing from a very low base and therefore
Mm.
result of, if you want, a pent-up demand. When we talk about the industry and the segment, leisure travel will be the main driver for this growth, as because most of the business travel is very much affected by a plethora of factors. And think about new working practices, working from home, working remotely, talking about workations, which is becoming so popular, and a lot of companies are providing these opportunities for people to work, from different destinations, and have all the capabilities there provided for them. But equally, when we talk about business travel, we need to focus also on the sustainability and the use of these important digital tools and the overall digitalization. Also, into the mix, you can throw here the capacity on short and medium haul routes are going to be the ones that will be driving this recovery. It's, when we talk about load factors and, comparing that, for example, with 2019, the average global passenger load factors are still not within the ballpark that they were back in 2019.
Hmm.
At the moment, they're within the levels of 70%, um, compared to, let's say, 80 or 89% in 2019. And of course, this is going to affect the capacity.
Can you explain that load factor a little bit more for me? Because I've never heard that term before.
So this is very much how many travelers or how many passengers the company, the airline will be carrying. So, and how full the aircrafts will be. So this is essentially what we're seeing, at the moment. But of course, this is not the peak season, right? And, we're seeing that capacity has been cut in the past because of the zero travel, and the airlines really wanted to kind of respond very quickly. And one of the reasons why we're not seeing these levels is because these carriers are going to expand on that to increase that capacity if they see more pent up demand.
Got it. So as demand goes up, that capacity will rise accordingly.
Yes, that these are the expectations at least.
Mhm. Got it. Well, the demand seems to be there. I know a lot of people who are out there, like, actively looking for travel, but with inflation impacting us personally, it's just a little bit harder to find things that fit into what we had budgeted from all of this pent-up demand. You haven't gone on a trip in a couple of years, you've got some money to spend on travel. So the personal effects of inflation are probably having an effect on demand as well.
Absolutely. And here we need to talk about the rise of the oil prices because this is undeniably having this direct impact on the airline operational costs.
Right.
And for some of these, players, these costs could be between 20 and 40%. And
Mm.
as you can imagine, this is a substantial percentage when you think about the operating expenses and therefore, the impact they would have on the revenues. But when we talk about that, I think it's very important also to mention here that most of these airlines would be adopting and implementing hedging policies. And that can vary between regions and the type of airlines. And probably you would ask me what a hedging is.
I would ask you that because when we had our preliminary conversation about that, that was the first time I'd ever heard that airlines do something like this, and everyone I've talked to recently says, "I'm looking for flights, but fuel costs are so high, so the prices are going up," and it kind of, like, broke my brain. So if you could explain that.
Absolutely. So, what hedging is, it's very much a strategy which involves buying certain amount of fuel at a fixed price for a delivery for a certain period of time. So, think about this as an insurance, as a protection of the airline against any future oil price increases. And this is when it could vary between, as I said earlier, between regions, between the type of airlines. So, for instance, low cost carriers, and think about here operators like EasyJet, Ryanair in Europe, Southwest in the US, they would apply hedging rates, which is very much helping them against these risks. But there are other operators like American Airlines, Delta, United, they tend not to hedge their fuel, as a result of which you would see these skyrocketing ticket prices,
Mm,
which most of the time these carriers they do not have a lot of choice but to pass on that cost onto the passenger, onto
mm.
the end consumer. And of course, this is not good news because after nearly 2 years of zero travel, carriers are keen to attract more people traveling. this mode of transport, because we also know that the competition the of the air travel, and especially when we talk about sustainability and the importance of decreasing CO2 emissions. High speed rail is there also as an option, especially in regions where it is very well developed and is
Mhm.
a direct competition to the airlines. So increasing ticket prices is going to impact further that recovery. And, a lot of consumers will be thinking, well, how can I afford a holiday if these ticket prices are constantly increasing? And on the other hand, of course, you need to think about how these airlines are going to prevent incurring more losses, because
Mm.
during COVID-19, most of them, they had these huge financial problems, and they had to be um, kind of held by the local governments in order not to file for bankruptcies, right? So
Mhm.
it is a double-edged sword, but most of these airlines have that hedging in their pocket, if you want to help them ride the wave of uncertainty.
Yeah, I that still just, like, blows my mind. I wish I could hedge my fuel costs at this point. So if some companies are hedging their fuel and some companies aren't, do you think that airlines that have hedged are going to raise prices to kind of, like, match with their competition? Are the prices of both going to be going up?
I think it varies, right? So
Mhm.
those airlines that have hedged their prices, they probably will not be increasing the ticket prices, because they still want to kind of attract more consumers and operate and expand on their route network where that demand is coming. Of course, those that haven't used the hedging, they have to pass on that price, and inevitably will affect how many people are using them, how many are booking through their websites, and what type of holidays are they choosing. So what I mean here is whether this would be short haul versus long haul. But ultimately, as I said earlier, there is this preference of the consumers, and we refer to it as the revenge travel,
Yeah.
because travel will always be important.
Mm.
Everybody wants to have a holiday. And coming out of these, difficult times when we were not allowed to socialize, we were not allowed to meet with people, we as a human beings, we aim to have that opportunity to explore
Mhm.
new places, and be with your family or be with your friends, right? So I think this pent up demand is being driven by that revenge holiday trend that we're kind of expecting to drive and to continue to drive that interest.
I love the idea of a revenge holiday, both as, like, how you were speaking of it, but in other ways, a revenge holiday. So yeah, the demand is there, and I think that previously we've all gotten so used to the costs of travel being fairly low, but I don't think everyone thinks about the other ways in which inflation could impact the airlines. So it's not just fuel costs. Can you tell us what else might be affecting airlines?
Yes, I think when you talk about inflation, it been noted that is the highest in 40 years, right? And most of these players within the aviation segment will be concerned about um, how is inflation impacting their operations,
Mhm.
their debt levels, and what they need to do in order to contain that, so that they're able to kind of have this recovery that is expected.
Mm.
I think when we talk about airlines, it's a mixed bag, and why I'm saying this is because we have the debt levels, and if an airline, for example, has a strong liquidity and ability to pay its debt in nominal terms, the higher rates of inflation will actually help these carriers,
Mm.
as they will be aiming to decrease their debt levels. And I know that many central banks have been raising their rates, and they will continue to do so, right? Within, the next year,
Mhm.
hopefully, months, but not until the end of the year. But these nominal rates will still be below the rate of that
Mm.
inflation, and that gives that opportunity for an airline to be able to pay its debt. But then it comes another question: which are these airlines that have that liquidity, especially as they're coming out of COVID? So it's a little bit difficult to say which companies will benefit, which players will be struggling with that. But overall, if there is liquidity, cash in the bank, most of these players will be better off as a result and the impact of the inflation. I think the other perspective, and very much, I think is quite important, is the airfares. And you know, let's focus on the US.
Mhm.
I think back in April, the airfares have been increasing, I think 20% and even more.
Yeah.
And, even when you compare domestic flight with an international flight, you could see that the price for domestic flight is much more expensive, even, compared to international. And, all this is, quite problematic. But then you're also seeing that other airlines are kind of identifying that there is no decline in booking, just the opposite.
Mhm.
And, I was kind of focusing on the performance of Lufthansa and its budget carrier Eurowings. And they've identified that by end of May, they actually had very strong booking patterns, indicating that consumers are embracing travel and what we've just talked about. And they're determined to make up for this lost
Mhm.
time with their families, even if the prices are going up.
Mhm.
But when we talk about airfares, we have to point out here that cost conscious and price sensitive travelers will be affected by the rising inflation and the airfares, and they would be looking for these cheaper deals. And from a route network perspective, they would be steering away from traveling long haul, instead, probably closer to their country or within the region, so that they are able to afford, in light of these increases.
Mhm.
I think another interesting development that we're seeing is that a lot of these airlines are thinking outside of the box, if you want, and they're introducing diverse payment options. And one of them is called Fly Now, Pay Later,
Yes.
where they offer these flexible installment options that can allow the customers to spread the cost, and not only for their flight but also for their hotel or the holiday overall. And consumers can pay via monthly installments, and they can settle early at any time without penalty, and of course have that financial protection for their booking. It is not a new trend. It has been going on, I think, since 2015,
Mhm.
but it is considered to be another factor that could contribute for the revival of the segment, but also the industry, the travel and tourism industry overall. Um, and I'm quite optimistic about that because it gives us more options to spread the cost and travel, especially in time that it's so difficult because
Yeah.
of these problems, the war in Ukraine, and the macroeconomic aspects that we're facing every day. But we can't talk about inflation and we can't talk about the airlines and not mention what is happening at the moment. It is the staff shortages that most of these players are seeing and experiencing. And here in Europe, in the US as well, and other parts of the world, we've seen that there are huge delays at the airports,
Yes.
mayhem, and, you know, even the airline crew being asked to help in. And even here in the UK, there were cases where police has been asked to come in and support the handling of passengers.
Wow.
And I think this is very much on the back of shortage and the lack of trained personnel. Because when
Mhm.
the crisis hit, the COVID-19 crisis hit, we've seen that most of these players within the aviation industry, not only the airlines, but equally the airports, they've had to really embrace cost cuttings in order to protect, to, if you want to be in a survival mode, right? But that is, of course, kind of having a negative impact now, because there is no handling jobs at airports, the ground handling jobs at the airports. There is shortage of people that can help with that. The security clearance with the new people that are coming into to help takes time. It's not a process that can happen overnight,
Mhm.
and all that is leading to that additional pressure on the industry overall as we head towards the summer season for some markets, of course, here Europe and North America. And inevitably it is going to be another important problem that they need to address in parallel of monitoring how inflation is going to impact them, and whether actually it's going to hurt um, that pent up demand.
I have a family member who works in the airline industry, and I told him I was doing this podcast, and he was like, "Yeah, airlines are gonna be fine. Like, inflation's not gonna have that much of an impact," and I thought that was really interesting. So is there anything that airlines could be doing to better improve their situation?
I think for as long as they're consumer centric,
Mhm,
for as long as they are able to have that agility, flexibility, um, I do agree that the airline industry will be able to survive that crisis.
mhm,
I think, especially when we talk about the aviation industry, it has been, going through so many difficulties, back in 2008, the financial crisis, so many difficulties, and they've always been able to come back fast and, recover from that. I think this is another hurdle,
mhm,
but they are having the capabilities to do that for as long as they have that, as I said, agility and flexibility to operate and think very quick and fast, to adopt strategies that can uh, support them throughout the whole process, whether, recruiting more people to handle that increasing flow of travelers, or whether thinking about what kind of payment options they can offer to the consumers, or whether this is a package holiday as part of their proposition on their websites,
mm,
or even talking about sustainability, and not only talking but actually acting on that, um, and making sure that they deliver on that interest from the and that demand from the consumers on more sustainable policies and more sustainable strategies from them. I think they will be okay indeed.
yeah. So staying flexible and listening to the consumer's demands and what we want and need. Anything that you would any advice you would have for consumers who are looking at flights and looking at travel right now?
Well, my advice is, that they should travel
Yes.
and explore new places, new destinations, because it's such a great industry. It has been evolving so much, it's so dynamic. And we all love a nice holiday so that we can relax, recharge our batteries. So, absolutely keep traveling no
Mhm.
matter what. So, that would be my advice.
Yeah, and, like, bring your patience pants because it might be difficult at the airport, but
Absolutely.
we all wanna do it, so it's gonna happen, and if anyone out there has any recommendations on where I can use my American Airlines voucher, you can send those directly to me. There will be some links with some additional content down in the description below if you're interested in learning more, and Nadesha, thank you so much for joining me today. This was truly enlightening, and I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank you, Jessica. Pleasure was all mine as well.